Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is the December edition of our office's Planning Lunches at Noon monthly webinar series. I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping while people continue to enter the webinar. This month's webinar is on housing trends in New Hampshire. We're going to be looking at diving into the data. Before we get going, just a few webinar logistics that we're going to be having. If you have any questions, the best way to do this is type questions into the chat box. You can also raise your hand. We will, however, reserve having the question and answer session until after each portion of the webinar. Also, we are recording the presentation portion of this webinar, just so you need to be aware of that. This screen, I think you all probably know how to do this now, but there's information there on where the chat box button is in Teams and raising your hand and that sort of thing. So let's move on. Here's our agenda for today's webinar. For the first 15 minutes or so, by the way, I'm Ken Gallagher with the Office of Planning Development. I'm a principal planner there. I'm going to be discussing the most recent, this is interesting, most recent estimates and trends in New Hampshire's housing supply. I've been working at OPD and its predecessors going back to the Office of State Planning, all the way back to the 1990s. And in addition to demographic work, I have chaired the New Hampshire GIS Advisory Committee and its technical user group. The rest of the webinar will be a presentation of data that has been collected over the past year for the regional housing needs assessments that are underway in the state. And our presenters will be Rachel Dewey, who is a senior data analyst at the Stratford Regional Planning Commission, and Zachary Swick, a senior GIS analyst at the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, which serves Manchester and 13 other municipalities in South Central New Hampshire. Rachel has been at Stratford Region for the last 7 years. She works with other state agencies and other regional planning commissions to improve sharing and processing of data between agencies. And Zach has worked for over a decade in regional planning and community development. Once again, we will hopefully have time at the end of each of these sections to entertain 1 or 2 questions. Otherwise, we'll do them all at the end of the webinar. So again, please type your questions into the chat and let's begin. All right, first section will be this our annual report on the estimates and trends in New Hampshire's housing supply, now as of 2022. Why are we doing this? Our office's housing data is collected as part of the State Population Estimates Program, which is authorized by RSA 78A25, which directs us to annually estimate the resident population for all cities and towns as of July 1st of the preceding year. So the official purpose of this is for distribution of the state meals and rooms tax to every municipality. But as we all know, the population estimates do serve many other purposes, including allowing us to keep track of the change in housing units in the state every year. Okay, I'm seeing a question about somebody can't see the presentation. Alvina, is anybody else having that problem?
I think it's just one person. It might be something with their on their end.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Somebody else is saying they can see it. Okay.
You might want to relog on.
Okay. So moving forward, we'll need certain ingredients in order to produce our population estimates. We need the numbers from the most recent decennial census, so that's 2020, and then we add in the change in dwelling units for each municipality, plus the change in the population who are living in group quarters, such as nursing homes, dormitories, prisons, etc. So then to get the change in housing units, we send out a survey to every municipality. We find out how many building permits have been issued for each type of housing unit. We then use this formula that is shown here to estimate the current year's population who are living in households. So we have the estimated number of housing units in 2021. It's right here. Then we add the number of housing units permitted by each municipality, resulting in the number of new added units as of July 1st, 2022. We then have to apply an occupancy rate, which we get from the 2020 census, to account for vacant housing or second homes. And then to get the final estimated population, we apply the number of persons per household as calculated at the 2020 census. And here's an illustration of that. And this number here, 6,047, would be what we would get for that particular town after applying all of those factors. I've shown this slide, our sample dwelling unit survey form, in past presentations as well. Just to clarify, we ask for the number of permits issued in calendar year 2021, and we assume a 6-month time frame for construction. So that means our housing unit totals will be as of July 1st, 2022. The report, you will see when you get it, breaks out the permit totals into single family, 2 family, 3 or 4 family, and 5 family or more housing units, as well as manufactured housing. The form also has a line for conversions of buildings. So for instance, from non-housing into some type of housing, or from single family into multifamily, that sort of thing. For consistency, we apply anything we collect as a conversion we apply that number to the 2 family housing units total. So let's look at the results that we've gotten this year as of 2022. Right off the bat, we saw a sharp increase in the number of units constructed. It was 4,446 last year, up to 4,937 this year. That's an 11% increase. And overall, this is just continuing a general trend that we have seen since 2011, which was sort of the low point in the recent history in terms of permits being issued. The number for this past year, though, is still a great deal lower than the previous high point back in 2004. We've only just this year gotten over the level of more than half of that high point in 2004. So how does this impact the housing goals in our state, which has been a topic of much discussion and attention recently? So overall, since 2004, the average growth in the number of permits issued has been 9.5% a year. So if that rate of increase of permits continues, and of course that's a very big if, there would be actually over 76,000 new housing units by 2030. Now, for comparison, New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority has had a contractor route policy which projected that the state needs to have 66,000 new units by 2030, including 59,000, almost 60,000 new year-round units, okay, not vacation homes or whatever. And these figures are based on projected population growth and on aiming at a target of 5% rental vacancy and 2% ownership vacancy by 2040. Another thing to be aware of is this year's figures do not show yet any of the impact of the $100 million Invest NH initiative that is now started, because again, we are looking at building permits that were issued in 2021. Also, another major caveat is that 618 of these units that were reported as being issued during 2021 were from a single town of Merrimack. So when you have large, basically blips of data all occurring at once, it's very likely that it will be a different level next year. One point we've discovered from this year's data is that the greatest amount of growth in housing in the state has occurred in the largest communities in the state. And that's not as necessarily as obvious as it sounds, because what we mean is that the communities with the greatest populations contribute a greater share of the new housing in the state than the share of their existing populations. Okay, just 17 communities, which represent 38% of the total population in the state, just 17 communities permitted 50% of the total housing, new total housing units. And we have a list here on this slide of the 7 communities in the state that permitted over 100 units: Merrimack, Nashua, Londonderry, Rochester, Concord, Manchester, and Epping. Here's a graph illustrating the concept. So the bars are grouped by the number of units permitted by a municipality. We have 100 units per municipality here, 51, et cetera, down to 0, and actually a negative number. Negative number being where there would have been demolitions, for instance. The blue bars represent the percentage of the state population in each group of communities, while the orange bars represent the percentage of housing units permitted in each group. So, as you can see, the towns that issued permits for 100 or more units had 24% of the state's population, but issued 35% of the permits, and so on. So it's these top 3 groups of communities. In all 3 cases, greater share of housing units permits were issued than their share of the population. And then the pattern is reversed for the smaller communities in the state. So let's look at a few details from the totals of the permits. We see that it was slightly over 50% for single family, 2,600 units, about 44% for multifamily. This is a much greater percentage of permits issued for multifamily units than normally has been happening, either in past years where we've conducted our surveys or in the previous 2 censuses. And you can see the censuses listed below, where multifamily was 36% and 31% in the last 2 decennial censuses. We do have geographic variations. The top 3 counties issuing single-family permits were areas where growth has traditionally been highest: Rockingham, Hillsborough, and Merrimack counties. But the 4th county is kind of a new one to us this year. Carroll County issued only 8 units fewer than Merrimack County. Multifamily units are pretty standard pattern, though a much greater amount were in Hillsborough County, and of course that's because that's where the town of Merrimack is, which had its large parcel of 600 plus units permitted. Only 1 county has issued more permits for multifamily than single family. I'm going to move ahead here. Here's a map that gives the where the total number of units issued per county, and then broken down by multifamily or single family. And so here again, you can see how Hillsborough dominates the others, mainly because of the large number of multifamily housing that was permitted. At the municipal level, once again, the most single-family units permitted were in Londonderry, again, places mostly in the southern and eastern parts of the state. One thing of interest is that the second bullet with the showing the increase in single-family housing as a percentage of existing stock. This time around, every single one of these towns is in the White Mountains or the North Country. So they started with a small amount of housing and increased by 2 to 4%. But in previous years, we've had towns in other parts of the state as well. That might be an interesting pattern, which we can probably find some reason for, I'm sure. I'm sort of going quickly here just so we can get on to the rest of the presentation. To recap, here are some of the highlights for this year's results. And again, just as a reminder, please note this year's figures do not show yet any of the impact of the $100 million Invest NH initiative. And again, the caveat about the 618 new units possibly affecting the pattern of growth all occurring in Merrimack. Nevertheless, so again, we've got the 11% increase over the previous year. We've got a 9.5% annual increase, which, if it were to continue, which is not at all certain, we would have many more than 66,000 units. Again, just remember that most of half of the growth in the state in the housing permits are occurring in just 17 communities, representing a little under half of the state's population. And then again, normally you see the pattern of high growth in the Southeast, and that's certainly continuing to occur, but we're seeing higher than usual growth in more recreation-oriented areas of the state, including Carroll County and other communities around the White Mountains. So that is all I have right now. If we have if you don't mind, if we have another question. Okay, I'm going to answer one question that we have right now. Tara is asking, would the current rate meet the projected need for year-round housing? And I think the answer to that is yes, it would meet the need for year-round housing. That's the short answer. The long answer is, I guess, we don't actually know how much of this housing is done for year-round or vacant, or second home housing, because we don't actually ask that information in our survey. So perhaps we could approach it by looking at our the model that we use to estimate the state's population, where we would have to apply a certain proportion. So we don't actually have that particular answer yet, but I would say it's pretty close. And so I'll just follow up with this other one question. Is there a way to view vacancy by county or by town? I don't know what you mean by the word view, but that information is available through the census data, census.gov. Certainly for the 2020 census, they do already have vacant versus occupied housing as of 2020. And that's really the best we can do when we do our population estimates. We stick with that rate for the rest of the decade. So that data is available at data.census.gov. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel and Zach to continue their presentation, because they have a lot of good slides to show. So thank you, everybody.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Ken. My name is Rachel Dewey. I am at the Stratford Regional Planning Commission, and I'll get us started with the housing needs data. For those of you that are not familiar, regional planning commissions are political subdivisions of the state. There are 9 in New Hampshire. I am over here in the Dover and Rochester area, and Zach is in the Manchester area here. And we are here today to talk about the housing needs assessment project that we've been working on. Housing needs assessments are documents that we update every 5 years that look at current trends and future needs for housing at the state and regional level. This year, the 9 RPCs received funding through the American Rescue Plan Act to complete our RHNAs at the same time. And this has allowed us to work together on surveys, research, and data analysis. Today, we'll share some key findings from across the state that come from the surveys that we conducted and condition and trend analysis from this project. There were 4 surveys conducted as part of the RHNA. Each RPC hosted our own surveys, but we all asked the same questions, and for anything that was multiple choice, we provided the same set of answers. The general public survey reached over 3,000 participants across the state, and the employer survey reached over 600 employers. The landlord survey and statewide social service providers survey were both statewide surveys, and they had lower participation. The general public survey asked participants what housing they have now versus where they want to be in 5 years. as well as asking participants for thoughts on how to address housing shortages and what types of housing we need to have more of across the state. In addition to the surveys, the RPCs analyzed historic condition and trend data. Working from a list of about 80 metrics, we identified methodologies and data sets that worked across the state and shared the workload amongst the RPCs. Data and GIS staff at the RPCs met regularly throughout the project to collaborate on the data. Through this effort, we have identified some statewide trends. The population is increasing, although population growth is expected to slow significantly until 2040, after which the population will start to decline due to an aging population. Hold on, that's not the right slide. There we go. Across the state, the population over 65 has been increasing. In northern New Hampshire, in the North Country Council region, the population over 65 has grown by 6% in the last 10 years. Many towns with higher senior populations do not have senior care facilities nearby, which makes it difficult for residents to stay in place as they age. Additionally, the number of minors per household is declining across the state, as seen in the chart on the left for Rockingham Planning Commission's region. The chart to the right shows the population by age in the Stratford region, where the population under 18 and the population 35 to 54 are both decreasing, which we estimate is children and their parents. These two trends combined result in an increasing average age, as well as a decreasing household size. As Ken mentioned in his presentation, the housing production that we see today is still around half of what we saw at the peak of the pre-recession permitting. And with this decrease in new housing comes a decrease in months to absorb, as there's not a lot of housing on the market. So anything that is listed is sold fast, which is causing an increase in prices that we're seeing in both the renter market, which has increased 26 to 32% over the last 5 years, and the purchase prices, which have increased 10% in the last year, which makes it much harder to purchase, particularly when you need to save for high down payments. Anything less than 20% down results in added insurance, making mortgages less affordable than rent. And today's higher interest rates can decrease monthly mortgage payments by over $900 more a month than they would have been a year ago. Rockingham is one of the most expensive regions in the state. In the tables here, we can see from 2010 to 2022, the average rent in the Rockingham region increased by about 47%, and the purchase prices almost doubled in the same time. As the cost of housing increases, workers in many of the state's largest occupations are being priced out of housing. Median wages of the 15 occupations that we selected to look at here are insufficient to afford median home prices, and many of them are also insufficient to afford median rents. This issue is widespread, and I asked the other RPCs to send me which metrics they thought I should highlight today, and this metric was mentioned the most. While there are many things that we have in common across the state, there are some that vary widely. One of those is the sources of population growth. The population is increasing in 7 of the 9 regions in the state, but this is mainly driven by people moving into the regions. Only 3 regions have a natural population growth, meaning that there were more births than deaths over the decade from 2010 to 2019. These regions were Southern, Nashua, and Stratford. The regions with the largest natural population loss were North Country, Lakes, and Rockingham. Only 2 regions saw a net loss, North Country and Southwest, and they were both by under 1,000 people each. Another area where we vary widely across the regions is the number of short-term rental units. The North Country region has long been a tourism destination. Short-term rentals in the North Country make up 51% of all short-term rentals in the state. Recent growth in visitor volumes coupled with increased access to short-term and vacation rental markets through online platforms like Airbnb and Vrbo have added demand in the housing market in the North Country, which by reducing the supply and causing increases in prices. Housing condition is another metric that varied significantly by region. Every region in the state has over 300 occupied homes without either a kitchen or plumbing. 71% of these such units in Upper Valleys region are owner occupied, followed by 57% in the Lakes region. Rockingham had the lowest occupancy for these units, with 20% of them being vacant. Now I'm going to look at just some data for my region. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program was a program through New Hampshire Housing that provided assistance to families in need to help cover the cost of rent and utilities. The program started in March of 21 and is ending this month. But in that time, over 3,000 households in the Stratford region received assistance. About 70% of the funding used in the Stratford region was to cover either current or overdue rent. In the trend chart here, we see a big spike in the winter months. We would have expected to see another spike in the fall and winter of 22 as families turn the heat back on at rates that are more than double what we saw last year. But as the program is ending this month, the applications have started to taper off in October. Another metric of housing need that we looked at was overcrowding versus overhousing. Overcrowding is when there are at least 2 more individuals than bedrooms in a housing unit, and overhousing is where there's at least 2 more bedrooms than there are residents. In the Stratford region, 17% of renters are overcrowded, which could be multiple roommates splitting rent or large families in small apartments that do not have enough bedrooms for the residents to each have their own space. Meanwhile, 24% of owners are overhoused. This may be due to empty nesters who bought their homes a decade or 2 ago to raise their families, but the children have since moved out, leaving many empty bedrooms. And finally, a look at where to add housing. In the Stratford region, we looked at the land area zoned for residential use, subtracted out the land that had anything built on it, for example, houses or roads. We also subtracted conservation land, wetlands, and water, and steep slopes, leaving the map on the left of currently buildable land zoned for residential use. We also looked at how much of that land has access to water and sewer infrastructure. And in the map to the right, we can see the small patches of residential land that can support denser housing and have access to that infrastructure. I'll turn it over to Zach.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, I believe I have taken control. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Zach Swick. I work for the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission. We are mostly centered, or we are centered around Manchester, but we include many other large towns within our region, like Derry, Londonderry, as well as some of our small communities such as Francistown, Deerfield. Well, Rachel kind of went through the whole region as a whole. I'm going to focus just on ours, just on my region, and I'm also going to look at things beyond the census. The census data was the backbone of our data, and it was, without it, this exercise like this would be impossible. But we also did look at lots of new data sets, some of them for the first time, and there were some really interesting points that we could take away from those. So I'll just begin with a quick little overview, a long-term view of our region. So you can see that these are the 14 towns in our region plus the regional value and then the state as a whole. And this is looking at the annual average number of new housing units. And you can see that everybody over here in the 80s was growing much faster, and then the 90s slowed down a little bit and then picked up again in 2010. So New Hampshire, slowed down. And then once again, when the financial crisis happened, didn't really recover that. There are some exceptions, like in our region, Auburn grew fairly quickly in the last decade. But again, you can see that we were growing about, around 5 to 3% in the 80s, and then that slows down to like now we're about less than 1%. And as Rachel commented on, this is the left. This is the average number of days a house is on the market in our region. And so on the left is the average number of days. On the right is the number of listings that are active. And again, you can see that the number of days something that's on the market before it sells plummets, as does the actual number of listings. And that is reflected in the overall price. Again, as listings is supply plummets, prices grow very quickly. And as Rachel kind of made some comments on, we also have seen changes in our region in terms of household size, and that varies significantly based on the type of household and also the tenure, whether a person is homeowning or renting. And so within our region, we have about half of our single family homes have 3 or more person, but when we get down to multifamily, it's only about 1 in 5. And that can vary depending on the municipality. I've combined for some of these analyses, Manchester has its own, animal, and then all the towns that are above 10,000 residents, which is about half, and then all of our towns that are below 10,000. And you can see that there is some variability between them, but overall the main trends stay much the same. For household size, we can see that the largest household sizes are again on owner-occupied housing units, and so renters are smaller, but not we're not talking huge differences here. We are seeing large differences though in household size over time. As Rachel mentioned, we have far fewer minors per household than we used to. So here this chart is showing the number of minors per household in 1980, and then again in 2020. For our region, we lost the number of minors per household fell about 35% over those 40 years. For some of our towns, it fell by more than 50%. And that's true what we see across the state as well, where New Hampshire is about 0.8 in 1980. Now it's 0.46. And again, why we're seeing that is because we have an aging population. This is a graph showing the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission region populations for those less than 20 years old and those 65 years and older as a percentage of the total population. And you can see that the solid lines here are what's already happened. This is the fact, and the dotted lines are the projections. For the solid lines, those less than 20 years old have come down 20% as a percentage of the total population in the last 50 years, and it looks like it's projected as about to level out. The 65 years and older was a pretty constant up until about 2010, and now we're seeing some growth, and we're expected to see significant growth up until about the 2030s when it starts to level off some. Ping-ponging around here a little bit, we're going to look at something different. This is an example of a data set that we typically don't look at the Regional Planning Commission. This is the number of refugees resettled just by year and by location. This is looking at a 10-year stretch in the last 10 years. You can see that region-wide, we're talking from about maybe 3,000 individuals during that period of time. And the number is fairly consistent. The black line here is New Hampshire. The orange line is Manchester. It's fairly consistent. When you get to about 2016, the number comes down a fair bit and it's lower for a while. And then with the pandemic, it just plummets and has not really recovered since then. So, when, crossing borders became much harder, obviously refugee resettlement slowed down. We also see that it varies significantly based on municipality. So about, 2/3 of the population has been resettled in Manchester and Concord. Concord has taken a very large number of refugees, which is, especially given its size, it's maybe a third the size of Manchester, and has taken more. Nashua has also taken a fair amount, and then every other community in the state has only taken 13. Now, this is based on the original placement. We, can't track refugees over time, but this is at least where they were originally placed. Another data set that we got to work with that was very interesting was the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is commonly known as Section 8 vouchers. There are two major housing authorities working in our state. I'm sorry, in our region. One is the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, and the other is the Manchester Housing Redevelopment Authority. Derry also has a housing authority, but it's much smaller. Of those two housing authorities statewide, there are currently about 15,000 households currently waiting to enter the voucher program. So these are people on the waiting list to even be issued a voucher. Statewide, there's about 600 here that have households that have vouchers, but have not been able to find a housing unit that will accept it. And then there are about 6,000 people between these two housing authorities that are, 6,000 households that are currently, have a household voucher and are living in a unit that has accepted it. We can also break down we can also break down units based on income restricted. Now, this could be anything from public housing, but or workforce housing. This is just something that says you have to make a level of a income to actually live here. And we start based off some of the stuff we got from New Hampshire Housing. We're able to develop some of our lists, and we can see that there is about 3,400 units, income restricted units in Manchester, and so which is perhaps not surprising. What is a little more surprising is when we look at the number of income restricted units as a percentage of all the income restricted units, and compare them as to the town's housing units as a percentage of the region's whole housing units. And there you can see that towns like Londonderry actually have more income restricted units than you would expect, given their percentage of the overall housing, which might be surprising to some people. But places like Londonderry have been building lots of workforce housing within the last, let's say 5 years. And so fairly easily or fairly quickly, they can get above that level. The graph the table on the right is looking again at the Housing Choice Voucher Program based on the number of housing vouchers per municipality. Again, it's not surprising that about the majority for our region are in Manchester. About 84% of all the Housing Choice Voucher programs households are there. Important to keep in mind for the Housing Choice Voucher Program that you're not tied to the unit; it's tied to the family, so the people can pick up and move to a different community and different household within that community. But you can expect that these trends will pretty much stay, or we expect these trends to stay relatively stable over the long term. Here's another example of what we did where we were trying to take a couple different data sets and combine them to pull out some new information. The map on the left is the average parcel size in acres for our 14 communities. This comes from the New Hampshire Department of Revenue, has a parcel mosaic, which is a very useful data set. If you don't use it, I would highly recommend you do. And that's just showing the average parcel size. You can see it's smallest here in the Manchester area, and then you get into some of the suburbs a little bit larger, and you get some more rural communities. It's smaller. And then we compare that against development patterns, and this is looking at the fragmentation of development. So this is, if you have, developed land versus next to greenfield, next to developed land, and comparing that, and you see that you have kind of this U-shaped where when you have these smaller parcels, you have lower levels of fragmentation, and then as you get larger, fragmentation grows, and then as you get even larger, it again falls down into following a kind of a U-shaped pattern. We also tried to keep in mind for this plan that we are, transportation planning and land use planning do not happen in a vacuum. We often treat them in this country like they do, but they have, one has a very significant influence on the other. And this is just using the example of Manchester. I'm going to look at Manchester for a couple times here. And it's not anything particularly special about Manchester. It's just that some of the data exists for Manchester that we can actually make the comparison. And the other is that the granularity of it is fine enough that we can do some of these analyses where if we wanted to do them for some of our other communities, it just wouldn't be possible. So for this one here, on the map on the left here, the red represents the streetcar network at its full built out extent, and all the black there is all the parcels that were developed before 1960. And on the right, we have the in red is the limited access highway, so that's going to be 293, 93 in Manchester, and then all the parcels that were developed after 1960. And you can see that where the transportation options were is moved to a large extent where these parcels were developed and whether they were ever developed. And this has influence, transportation again has a significant impact on land use. This is, a view of downtown Manchester within 1 mile. And so within 1 mile of downtown Manchester, there's over 820 acres that are reserved for off-street parking and driveways. This does not include streets, and this does not include on-street parking. And, from that, that's, rough back of the napkin analysis, it's about land that's worth $250 million and 8% of the total land's value. And some of the land, the city's most valuable land is currently used for parking lots. Again, taking a couple different data sets and comparing them together. This is using all census data, the parcel data from the New Hampshire Department of Revenue that I talked about, and I guess it's just those two in this case. And we can see that, that there are correlations between different patterns. So we have, as the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, as a metropolitan planning organization, have certain obligations, additional obligations to communities, our Title VI and EJ communities, which are minorities, those living in poverty, and those with limited English proficiency. And those are federally required obligations that we maintain. So that's what I looked at here. And you can here on the top see the average acreage of a single family parcel. These are all our census tracts. I believe there are 60 plus in our region census tracts. And so they're looking at in terms of minority, those in poverty rate and low limited English proficiency rate. And you can see that there's a correlation. It's above, the level of the parcel size, correlates with the percentage of these particular groups with over, for about half of the variance can be explained based on the parcel size. And if we look at the percentage of single family housing, it's the same, just again, looking at the percentage of the all total housing units that are single family housing. Again, we see a correlation that is explains about 50% of the variation. This is Manchester again. We on the right, this is because we just had the decennial census. We have some really great fine grained data that they use for redistricting, and we were able to make use of that. So the map on the right is all the zoning districts in Manchester, except for those that have less than 200 residents with them. And so this is showing the percentage, the minority rate for all the zoning districts in the state and the city, with a darker red indicating a higher percentage minority residents. And then on the right, it's the same map, but in this case, I've just drawn in with the dashed green hash here is all the areas that are single family only zoning. changing gears here again, here is the, we looked at as part of the plan, municipal property rates, but I thought it was also important to look at them in terms of real value. So these are all of our towns plus the median for our region and the median for the state. Looking at these are inflation adjusted dollars going back to 2000. So you can see that, you know, everybody, it was highest, the real rate, property tax rate was the highest back in 2000, and then as property rates, or excuse me, property values skyrocket just before the Great Recession, the value goes down again, it collapses, so the real value goes, the real property tax rate goes up again, and then as we come into around 2020, it's gone back down again. So, you know, for our region, the the real rate is about 2/3 of what it was in 2000, and for the state it'd be about it's about the same. Just a couple more slides here to go through. One, again, we wanted to look at how parcel size affects prices, and we can do that from the New Hampshire Department of Revenue Administration's parcel mosaic. So this is taking all the single-family homes, existing single-family homes in our region, assigning them, ordering them by acreage, breaking them up into 10 different deciles, 10 different quantiles based in order, and then taking the average for each of those. And from that, you can see that the as one would expect, that as average acreage increases, so does the average property value. And for the average single-family home on 1 acre costs about twice in our region what it does on about 1/10 of an acre. And most of that growth happens, within here between the 0 and the 0 and the 3 acreage. Once you get out past that, it's pretty flat. Coming at it from a different direction, this is looking at dairy. So these are all the single-family homes in dairy, and looking at the property value per acre. So this is the average, again, taking in this case 20 quantiles, or so 20 ventiles, and taking the average for that parcel and then looking at the average value per acre for that. And we can see that the typical home in dairy on 1/10 of an acre is worth about 83 grand less than the typical home on 1 acre, but generates about 12 times as much gross revenue per area for the town. And this can have significant implications because we tend to think of the total big number and not the overall rate. And so if you have 10 acres that you can develop, in this case if you were developing them all to one acre, you would have about 430,000 gross property tax value, as opposed to 23 million if you developed it out to 0.1 acres. Now, again, this is just looking at the gross rate. This doesn't take into account, the cost of services. But even when we look at, these places that are getting very similar services, we do, see that it doesn't actually, there still is a disparity. Here's an example. I picked that mostly at random for one of our communities, and these are looking at 2 single-family parcels. One was built and is on 1/10 of an acre and built about 100 years ago. One was on 1 acre and built in, just before the Great Recession. And they both have water and sewer service. They're both served by public roads, but the one on the one on the left is much closer to federal aid eligible roads. It's much closer to state eligible roads, and it is less valuable. So the property value for this from this property is about 200 grand less than the one on the right, but the value per acre is about 10 times as high. So you're getting 10 times as much revenue from this parcel when it receives the same level of services that you would find, or comparable services to the one on the right. And I believe that's all we have, which leaves about 10 minutes for questions. I don't know if Ken, you want to take back over, or?
Sure. So Yeah, we'll turn to questions just a moment. Here are the contact information for the three of us, and you can expect, at least for our office, the housing report is not yet available online, but it will be shortly once it's passed our further reviews. So at this point, let me turn it to the chat. We do have time for a few questions. Let's see, were there some that we didn't answer earlier?
There was one, Ken.
Okay.
From Emily, how many communities are enabling conversion of large single-family homes into duplex or condos as a way to create additional units and provide ownership opportunities?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Zach or Rachel have come across that question yet.
No.
I've not.
Okay, so that is a good question, and I guess that's we'll have to figure out a way that maybe we can look into that.
Emily suggested her own answer, but she's only saying Exeter has done that. So
Okay.
There's one
Yeah.
from Stuart. What is the significance of the red shades on the comparative tax rates?
So I just sent a message there in the chat, but that's just showing a darker red means a higher absolute number. So it's just a heat map showing, the higher the value there, the higher the darker the shade of red. That's all that is.
If there were some questions from earlier, which you don't feel we answered yet, feel free to ask them again.
There was a link that Sarah Brightsman
Yes.
shared from New Hampshire Housing, and I will include that with our follow-up email as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Sarah.
And I guess the other question maybe I'll pose to Zach and Rachel then. So we've seen a lot of, you guys have been collecting a ton of data, for the housing needs assessments. What's the sort of the final schedule, the end point of the project? What will people be seeing and approximately when?
I can say for us, we are hoping to have a rough draft done before Christmas. That's our goal. And then, so it might be a little ambitious, but that's, it's good to aim high. And so we're going to do for that. And then we'll have to review it in there. So I'd expect it to be at least another month, but I really don't know for sure. Part of it has to do with some of the other factors that are components that are outside of our control.
Okay.
But early 2023 for sure would be my answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're targeting a January public draft. I'm not sure about the other RPCs, but I know that we've all been working on this for a while now, so I think that we'll all have drafts coming out in the next couple of months. So
Emily is asking, are there any interesting legislative initiatives coming up this year?
Well, that is a great question, because actually you'll want to come back next month to our January Planning Lunches at Noon series. I see Noah has put his camera on. Noah, would you like to describe who's going to be what people will be talking about in January?
Sure. So we're going to have, just get the day, I believe it's January 19th. We're going to have a planning and zoning 2023 session legislative primer with myself, Nate Grays from the New Hampshire Municipal Association, and Tim Corwin, who's the head of the New Hampshire Planners Association legislative committee, and also a senior planner in the city of Lebanon, talking about legislation.
So there you go. And as always, you're on our mailing list. So keep your eyes open for the announcement for the next meeting.
And then Sarah put another link in the chat. Tomorrow's Housing Matters Zoom with Housing Action New Hampshire will also be a look ahead at the legislative session. So that link's in the chat. I will also include that in the follow-up email. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you again.
Great. Let me see. I see there's a couple more slides here. Oh, hang on.
There are a couple of
That's
thank
just-
yous from Emily and
There we
Stuart.
go. Yes. Very good. Any other questions? And if not, once again, I want to thank you all for spending time with us today and finding out the information that we have to share. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in January, and make sure to come back and if you wish to find the recording of the webinars that we have. So thank you very much. And we will see you next month.